The shovel struck something that wasn't earth. Inspector Morrison knelt in the cramped cellar beneath the Notting Hill boarding house, his lantern casting trembling shadows across the brick walls. The year was 1889, and the autumn fog had settled thick over London streets above. Here, 20 feet below the cobblestones, the air hung heavy with decay and something else, the sickly sweet perfume of secrets buried too shallow. The landlady stood at the cellar stairs, her knuckles white against the wooden rail. She'd insisted the smell came from the drains, had blamed the rats, had sworn nothing was amiss. But tenants had whispered of sounds in the night, of footsteps where no footsteps should be, of voices that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards like prayers spoken backwards. Morrison's constables worked methodically, their spades revealing more with each careful scrape. The lantern light flickered across fragments of cloth, tarnished brass buttons, wisps of hair still clinging to bone. Outside, the fog pressed against the cellar windows like curious fingers, and somewhere in the darkness above, a church bell tolled the midnight hour. The boarding house held its breath, waiting to confess its sins. Chapter 1. The Scent of Secrets. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to an autumn evening in 1889, when London's fog rolled thick through the streets of Notting Hill, and secrets lay buried beneath the floorboards of a modest boarding house. This is the Bedside Historian, where we explore the darker corners of our shared past. I wonder where you are listening from tonight, and what hour finds you seeking these tales from history's shadows. Perhaps it is late where you are, and sleep calls softly. If you find comfort in these historical narratives, please consider subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us grow and continue bringing these forgotten stories to light in the quiet hours. Now, let us step into the gaslight and fog of Victorian London, where Inspector Morrison has just made a discovery that will haunt the residents of Notting Hill for generations to come. The shovel struck something that wasn't earth. Inspector Morrison knelt in the cramped cellar beneath the Notting Hill boarding house, his lantern casting trembling shadows across the brick walls. The year was 1889, and the autumn fog had settled thick over London streets above. Here, 20 feet below the cobblestones, the air hung heavy with decay and something else, the sickly sweet perfume of secrets buried too shallow. The landlady stood at the cellar stairs, her knuckles white against the wooden rail. She had insisted the smell came from the drains, had blamed the rats, had sworn nothing was amiss. But tenants had whispered of sounds in the night, of footsteps where no footsteps should be, of voices that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, like prayers spoken backwards. Morrison's constables worked methodically, their spades revealing more with each careful scrape. The lantern light flickered across fragments of cloth, tarnished brass buttons, wisps of hair still clinging to bone. Outside, the fog pressed against the cellar windows like curious fingers, and somewhere in the darkness above, a church bell tolled the midnight hour. The boarding house held its breath, waiting to confess its sins. The boarding house at 47 Pembridge Gardens had stood unremarkable among its neighbours for nearly 30 years. Built during the expansion of Notting Hill in the 1860s, it rose 4 stories above the street, its Georgian facade weathered by London's sooty air. The building housed 12 tenants at any given time, clerks and seamstresses, widowed ladies of modest means, young men seeking their fortunes in the great city. It was the sort of establishment that existed in the thousands across London, providing respectable lodging for those who could afford neither luxury nor destitution. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had managed the property for the past 7 years. A woman of 45 with greying hair pulled severely back and hands permanently stained from years of washing and cleaning, she maintained her establishment with an iron discipline that brooked no nonsense. Tenants paid their rent promptly or found themselves on the street. Visitors were discouraged after 9 in the evening. No drinking, no gambling, no improper conduct between the sexes. The rules were simple and absolute. Yet for all Mrs. Hartwell's vigilance, something had been amiss at 47 Pembridge Gardens for months. It had begun in late spring with complaints about the smell. At first, tenants mentioned it only in passing. A peculiar odour that seemed to drift up through the floorboards of the ground floor parlour. Mrs. Hartwell had dismissed their concerns, attributing the smell to the building's age, to dampness in the cellar, to the refuse collection that sometimes fell behind schedule in their corner of Notting Hill. By midsummer, the complaints had grown more insistent. Miss Catherine Pembroke, a governess who occupied a room on the first floor, reported waking in the night to sounds she could not identify. Scraping, shuffling, the soft whisper of something being dragged across stone. Mr. Herbert Blackwood, a young solicitor's clerk, claimed to hear voices in conversation beneath his room, though the cellar was supposed to be used only for storage. Mrs. Hartwell had inspected the cellar herself on several occasions throughout the summer months. The space was divided into several chambers, each with a low arched ceiling and walls of old brick. Crates and trunks belonging to former tenants filled much of the area, along with coal for the building's heating and various supplies for maintenance. She'd found nothing unusual, nothing that might account for the tenants' growing unease. The fog had been particularly thick that October evening when Inspector Morrison first arrived at the boarding house. A veteran of the Metropolitan Police with 20 years of service, Morrison was known for his methodical approach to investigation and his ability to remain calm in circumstances that unnerved younger officers. He'd been summoned to Pembridge Gardens not by Mrs. Hartwell, but by Dr. Edmund Fairfax, the local physician who attended to several of the boarding house tenants. Dr. Fairfax had grown concerned about the health complaints emerging from 47 Pembridge Gardens. In the span of 3 weeks, he had treated 6 different tenants for persistent headaches, nausea, and what they described as a sense of overwhelming dread that seemed to intensify when they spent time in the building's common areas. Miss Pembroke had fainted twice while taking tea in the ground floor parlour. Mr. Blackwood had complained of nightmares so vivid and disturbing that he had considered finding other lodgings despite his modest income. The physician had suggested to Mrs. Hartwell that the building might harbour some source of contamination, perhaps a gas leak or tainted water supply. When she continued to insist that nothing was wrong, Dr. Fairfax had taken the unusual step of contacting the police. His letter to the local station had been carefully worded, expressing concern for public health rather than suggesting any criminal activity. Nevertheless, it had been enough to prompt Morrison's visit. The inspector had arrived at 8:30 on that foggy October night, accompanied by Constable William Thorpe, an earnest young man who had recently joined the force. Mrs. Hartwell had received them in her small private parlour behind the main entrance hall, her manner polite but distinctly cool. She poured tea from a china service, and insisted once again that the tenants' complaints were exaggerated, perhaps even imaginary. "You must understand, Inspector," she had said, her voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to authority. "I have managed respectable lodging houses for 15 years. I know the difference between genuine problems and the sort of hysteria that sometimes affects people living in close quarters. These are impressionable individuals, unmarried women, young men away from home for the first time. They feed upon each other's anxieties." Morrison had listened politely, making notes in his leather-bound notebook. His experience had taught him that truth often lay somewhere between the extremes of any situation. Mrs. Hartwell might be correct about the tenant's susceptibility to suggestion, but Dr. Fairfax was not a man given to flights of fancy. The physician's concern suggested that something concrete was affecting the resident's health. "Nevertheless, Mrs. Hartwell," Morrison had replied, "I should like to speak with your tenants and examine the building. Dr. Fairfax's concerns are not to be dismissed lightly, and if there is some source of contamination, it would be better discovered sooner than later." The inspector had interviewed 6 tenants that evening, finding their accounts remarkably consistent despite their varied backgrounds and temperaments. All reported the same progression of symptoms: initial awareness of an unpleasant odour, followed by physical discomfort and increasing psychological distress. All mentioned sounds that seemed to emerge from below the ground floor, particularly during the quiet hours of evening and early morning. Miss Pembroke had been particularly articulate in describing her experiences. A woman of 32 who had served in several respectable households as a governess, she possessed the sort of practical intelligence that came from years of managing difficult children and demanding employers. She was not, Morrison concluded, the type to succumb easily to hysteria or suggestion. The smell comes and goes, she had explained, seated in the boarding house's main parlour while Mrs. Hartwell hovered nearby. Some days I noticed nothing at all, and I begin to think perhaps I was mistaken. Then evening falls and it returns, sweet at first, like flowers left too long in water, but underneath there is something else, something that makes my stomach turn and my head ache. She had paused, glancing toward Mrs. Hartwell before continuing. The sounds are worse than the smell, Inspector. They come at night when the house grows quiet, scraping, as if something heavy is being moved across stone, and voices, though I cannot make out the words. Sometimes there are other sounds, tapping, like someone knocking on wood, and once I could have sworn I heard weeping. Mr. Blackwood had provided similar testimony, though his account was coloured by the obvious embarrassment he felt at reporting what might be dismissed as nervous imaginings. A young man of 24 who worked for a firm of solicitors in the city, he had come to London from Yorkshire only 6 months earlier. His earnest manner and careful attention to detail impressed Morrison as much as his evident discomfort with the situation. "I'm not a fanciful person, Inspector," Blackwood had said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I have always prided myself on practical thinking. But something is wrong in this house, something that goes beyond ordinary explanation. The sounds I hear are not the natural settling of an old building. They are too regular, too purposeful, and there are times when I feel as though I am being watched, though I know myself to be alone in my room." By the time Morrison had completed his interviews, the fog outside had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall. Street lamps glowed like distant stars, their light barely penetrating the grey murk that transformed familiar London into an alien landscape. Inside the boarding house, gas fixtures cast their warm yellow light across wallpaper that had faded to the colour of old tea, creating an atmosphere that felt both cosy and somehow oppressive. The inspector had requested permission to examine the cellar, despite Mrs. Hartwell's obvious reluctance. She had led him and Constable Thorpe down a narrow staircase behind the kitchen, carrying an oil lamp that sent their shadows dancing across the brick walls. The cellar space was exactly as she had described, a series of connected chambers filled with the accumulated possessions of transient tenants and the practical necessities of maintaining a boarding house. Morrison had spent nearly an hour moving methodically through the cellar, examining the walls for signs of dampness or structural damage, checking the coal storage area for gas leaks, looking for any obvious source of contamination. The smell the tenants described was indeed present, though faint and difficult to identify. It seemed strongest in the easternmost chamber, where several large trunks and wooden crates had been stacked against the far wall. It was Constable Thorpe who first suggested that the floor itself might warrant examination. The young officer had been helping Morrison move some of the stored items when he noticed that the earth floor in one corner of the easternmost chamber appeared different from the rest, darker, more compacted, with an oddly uniform surface that suggested recent disturbance. Mrs. Hartwell had protested when Morrison announced his intention to excavate the suspicious area. "Inspector, surely you cannot mean to destroy my cellar floor based on nothing more than the nervous complaints of a few tenants. The cost of repairs alone would be considerable, and I have no insurance to cover such damage." But Morrison's instincts, honed by 2 decades of police work, had told him that something significant lay beneath that carefully smoothed earth. He had sent Constable Thorpe to fetch additional officers and excavation tools, despite the late hour and the difficulty of navigating London's fog-shrouded streets. By 11 o'clock, 4 constables were working carefully with spades and hand tools, removing earth from an area roughly 6 feet square. Morrison supervised their work by lantern light, instructing them to proceed slowly and systematically. Mrs. Hartwell had retreated to the cellar stairs, where she maintained her vigil with obvious distress but stubborn determination to oversee whatever was being done to her property. The first discovery had come within an hour of beginning excavation. At a depth of approximately 3 feet, Constable Thorpe's spade had struck something that produced a hollow sound distinctly different from the soft impact of metal on earth. Further careful digging had revealed what appeared to be wooden planking, arranged to form a crude cover over something below. Morrison had ordered the planks removed with extreme care, concerned that whatever lay beneath might be fragile or dangerous. As the wooden boards were lifted away, the smell that had plagued the boarding house tenants for months rose from the opening with renewed intensity. Even the experienced officers found themselves stepping back from the excavation, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The inspector's lantern revealed a carefully constructed chamber, roughly 4 feet deep and lined with brick. Inside, arranged with meticulous care, were the remains of what appeared to be multiple individuals. Fragments of clothing, personal effects, and human bones had been organized with a precision that spoke of deliberate, methodical work rather than hasty burial. As Morrison examined the hidden chamber by lantern light, the implications of the discovery began to settle over him, like the autumn fog that pressed against the cellar windows. This was not a single crime of passion or desperation, but evidence of something far more calculating and sinister. The careful construction of the brick-lined chamber, the methodical arrangement of remains, the elaborate concealment beneath the cellar floor, all suggested a killer who had worked with patience and planning over an extended period. The boarding house above them continued its quiet nighttime routine, unaware that the source of months of unease had finally been uncovered. Somewhere in the darkness, tenants slept restlessly in their narrow rooms, their dreams perhaps haunted by the whispers and footsteps that had troubled their waking hours. Mrs. B. Hartwell remained at her post on the cellar stairs, her face pale in the lantern light, her careful composure beginning to crack as the full magnitude of what lay beneath her establishment became clear. Morrison made the decision to secure the scene until daylight would allow for more thorough investigation. The cellar was sealed. The boarding house declared off-limits to all but essential personnel. Mrs. Hartwell was questioned extensively, but maintained her innocence of any wrongdoing, insisting that she had no knowledge of the chamber or its contents. As dawn began to break over London, painting the fog a ghostly grey, the inspector found himself standing in the small garden behind 47 Pembridge Gardens, breathing the cold morning air and trying to organise his thoughts. The discovery in the cellar was only the beginning. Now began the painstaking work of identification, of determining how many victims lay in that carefully constructed tomb, of uncovering the identity of someone who had turned a respectable boarding house into a charnel house. The morning brought not only light but also the attention of Morrison's superiors, representatives of the coroner's office, and the inevitable gathering of curious neighbours and newspaper reporters drawn by the police presence. The quiet boarding house in Pembridge Gardens had become the centre of what would prove to be one of London's most disturbing criminal investigations. Yet as Inspector Morrison prepared to delve deeper into the mysteries hidden beneath the floorboards, he could not shake the feeling that the excavated chamber represented only a portion of the truth. The meticulous planning evident in the killer's work, the extended period over which the crimes had apparently been committed, and the elaborate steps taken to conceal evidence all suggested a criminal mind of unusual cunning and patience. The fog began to lift as morning advanced, revealing the familiar streets of Notting Hill in the grey light of a new day. But for those who had witnessed the opening of that carefully sealed chamber, the neighbourhood would never again seem quite as safe or predictable as it had before. The scent of secrets had been released into the London air, and Inspector Morrison suspected that this was only the first chapter in a story that would prove far darker than anyone yet imagined. As our first evening in the company of Inspector Morrison draws to a close, we leave him standing in that small garden, the weight of discovery heavy on his shoulders, the London fog beginning to clear around him like veils being slowly drawn away from terrible truths. Tomorrow, we shall follow him deeper into the investigation that would reveal the full extent of the horrors hidden beneath Pembridge Gardens. Chapter 2: The Weight of Discovery. The earth beneath Morrison's knees held secrets like a confession box holds whispers. Each scrape of the constable's spades revealed fragments that spoke of lives cut short, of bodies buried without ceremony or prayer. The inspector's weathered hands trembled slightly as he brushed soil from what appeared to be a woman's hair comb, its mother-of-pearl surface dulled by years of darkness. The boarding house above them creaked with each gust of wind that swept across Notting Hill, as if the very timbers mourned what lay hidden in their foundation. Constable Williams, a young man whose enthusiasm for police work had not yet been tempered by the horrors of London's underbelly, paused in his digging to wipe perspiration from his brow despite the October chill. The lantern light caught the pale gleam of what might have been a finger bone, and Williams felt his stomach lurch. He had imagined his career in the Metropolitan Police would involve chasing pickpockets through Whitechapel's narrow lanes, not unearthing the remains of the forgotten dead beneath respectable boarding houses. The landlady, Mrs. Constance Hartwell, maintained her vigil at the cellar stairs. Her grey hair, normally pinned with military precision, had begun to escape its confines, creating a silver halo around her lined face. She wore the expression of a woman watching her carefully constructed world crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The boarding house had been her domain for 15 years, a sanctuary of respectability where clerks and shopkeepers paid their weekly rent and asked no questions about the occasional strange sounds that echoed through the walls after midnight. Morrison lifted his lantern higher, casting light into the furthest corners of the cellar. The brick walls, stained with decades of moisture and neglect, seemed to press closer in the flickering illumination. Here, in this subterranean chamber, the civilized world of gas lamps and morning newspapers felt impossibly distant. The inspector had served on London's police force for 23 years, had walked through scenes of violence that would haunt lesser men's dreams. Yet something about this cellar filled him with a peculiar dread that settled in his bones like winter fog. The first complete skeleton emerged as dawn broke somewhere above their heads. Williams and his partner, Constable Davies, worked with archaeological precision, brushing earth from bones that had been arranged with deliberate care. These were not the haphazard remains of paupers thrown into unmarked graves, but bodies that had been positioned with purpose, their arms folded across their chests in mockery of proper burial. The constables found scraps of clothing that spoke of the victim's stations in life, a silk ribbon that might have graced a governess's throat, brass buttons from a clerk's Sunday waistcoat, the remnants of a working woman's woolen shawl. Mrs. Hartwell's breathing had grown shallow and rapid. She gripped the wooden rail with such force that her knuckles appeared translucent in the weak light, filtering down from the kitchen above. The inspector observed her carefully, noting how her eyes darted between the emerging remains and the cellar's shadowed corners, as if expecting some dreadful revelation to materialize from the darkness itself. Years of police work had taught Morrison to read the subtle signs of guilt and complicity, the way conscience manifested itself in nervous gestures and telling silences. The boarding house had stood for nearly 60 years, a testament to Victorian propriety with its neat rows of windows and freshly painted shutters. Built during the reign of King William, it had weathered the social upheavals of the century, providing modest accommodation for London's growing army of clerks, seamstresses, and shop assistants. The neighbourhood itself bore witness to the city's relentless expansion, where fields of turnips had given way to terraced houses and gaslit streets. Yet beneath this facade of progress and respectability, the cellar held evidence of something far more ancient and terrible. Morrison's investigation had begun 3 days earlier, with a complaint from Miss Adelaide Porter, a seamstress who occupied the third-floor front room. She had reported sounds emanating from below her chamber during the small hours of morning. The scraping of metal against stone, footsteps that seemed to move in circles, and what she described as voices raised in conversation, though no words could be distinguished. Mrs. Hartwell had dismissed these claims as the nervous fancies of an unmarried woman approaching her 40th year. But other tenants had begun to whisper among themselves about the strange odours that seemed to seep through the floorboards. The second skeleton lay curled on its side like a sleeping child, though the bones clearly belonged to a fully grown woman. Fragments of a wedding ring still encircled the finger bones, its gold band tarnished black by years of burial. Davies held his lantern closer and observed what appeared to be marks upon the skull, indentations that suggested violence had preceded death. The constable's hands shook as he made careful notes in his leather-bound ledger, documenting each grim discovery with the methodical precision demanded by police procedure. Williams had grown increasingly pale as the morning progressed. The young constable possessed the keen instincts of his generation, men who had grown up reading penny dreadfuls and attending magic lantern shows, yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for the reality of excavating human remains in a cellar that reeked of decay and forgotten sins. Each bone that emerged from the earth seemed to carry with it the weight of an individual tragedy, leaves cut short and hidden away like shameful secrets. The third body lay deeper than the others, wrapped in what had once been a gentleman's evening coat. The fabric, though deteriorated, retained enough of its original quality to suggest the victim had possessed some measure of wealth or social standing. Morrison examined the remains with growing unease, noting the careful arrangement of the limbs and the presence of personal effects that had been buried alongside the body. A pocket watch whose gold case bore an engraved monogram, a pair of spectacles with wire frames, and what appeared to be a leather wallet containing the remnants of banknotes. Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally cracked as the constables unearthed a child's shoe, its leather surface blackened but still recognizable. She sank heavily onto the wooden steps, her hand pressed against her mouth as if to prevent words from escaping. The inspector watched her carefully, recognizing the signs of a woman confronting the full horror of what had transpired beneath her roof. Years of willful blindness were crumbling away like plaster from ancient walls, revealing truths too terrible to acknowledge. The cellar itself bore witness to decades of careful maintenance. Someone had reinforced the brick walls, had installed additional drainage, had even constructed crude shelving along one wall. These were not the random burial sites of a madman, but evidence of systematic planning that spoke of intelligence and forethought. Morrison observed tool marks in the earthen floor, indications that graves had been dug with precision and filled with equal care. The killer had been methodical, patient, and disturbingly organized in his disposal of the victims. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen above ground, the full scope of the horror became apparent. 7 complete skeletons lay arranged across the cellar floor, each positioned with the same deliberate care, each accompanied by personal effects that hinted at lives lived and dreams destroyed. The ages of the victims ranged from what appeared to be a child of perhaps 12 years to an elderly woman whose bones spoke of a lifetime of hard labour. Male and female, young and old, rich and poor, the cellar had welcomed all with equal hospitality. Williams discovered a leather journal wedged between 2 loose bricks in the cellar wall. Its pages, though damaged by moisture and time, contained entries written in a careful hand that documented dates, names, and what appeared to be detailed observations about each victim's final moments. The constable's voice broke as he read selected passages aloud, descriptions of fear and pleading that transformed abstract remains into human beings who had faced their end in this subterranean chamber of horrors. The forensic examination revealed evidence of restraints, iron rings bolted into the cellar walls, lengths of rope that had survived the years of burial, and stains on the brick surface that suggested prolonged captivity had preceded death. Morrison reconstructed the scenes in his mind, imagining the victim's final hours in this underground prison where screams would never reach the respectable world above. The boarding house had provided perfect cover, its legitimate tenants unknowingly shielding the killer's activities with their daily routines and ordinary lives. Mrs. Hartwell's revelation came as darkness fell over Notting Hill. Through tears and broken sentences, she confessed to knowledge she had carried for 15 years, secrets that had poisoned her sleep and haunted her waking hours. The cellar had been used by her predecessor, a gentleman named Aldrich Pemberton, who had operated the boarding house with apparent respectability while pursuing darker activities in the basement chamber. She had discovered the first bodies shortly after assuming ownership, had chosen silence over scandal, had spent 15 years pretending that evil could be contained by locked doors and willful ignorance. The inspector's lantern flickered lower as the oil burned away, casting the cellar into deeper shadow. 7 souls had met their end in this chamber, 7 lives that had been extinguished with careful deliberation and buried with methodical precision. The fog pressed against the cellar windows like curious spirits seeking entry, and somewhere in the darkness above, the boarding house settled into its foundations with sighs that sounded almost like relief. The secrets were emerging at last, rising from their shallow graves like prayers spoken backwards, and Notting Hill would never be quite the same. Morrison closed his ledger and prepared to face the long night ahead, knowing that this cellar held more secrets yet to be revealed, more victims yet to be named, and a killer whose identity remained hidden in the shadows of Victorian respectability, where monsters wore gentlemen's clothing and evil masqueraded as ordinary life. Chapter 3. The Landlady's Testament. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Inspector Morrison's office at Scotland Yard, casting long shadows across the scattered reports and witness statements that chronicled the growing horror beneath the Notting Hill boarding house. 3 days had passed since the discovery in the cellar, and already the case had taken on the peculiar quality that marked London's most notorious criminal investigations. The city's newspapers had begun their fevered speculation, their headlines growing bolder with each edition. But Morrison knew the truth lay buried far deeper than any journalist's imagination could reach. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton sat across from his desk, her black morning dress rustling with each nervous movement. The landlady of the boarding house on Pembridge Road had maintained her innocence with a steadfastness that might have been admirable under different circumstances. Her weathered hands, spotted with age and marked by decades of hard work, clutched a worn leather handbag as though it contained her last earthly possessions. The autumn morning had brought with it the kind of penetrating chill that seemed to seep through London's very stones, and Mrs. Pemberton's breath came in visible puffs despite the coal fire burning in Morrison's office grate. The inspector studied her carefully, noting the way her pale blue eyes darted between his face and the window, never quite settling on any single point for more than a moment. She had operated the boarding house for nearly 15 years, taking in the sort of transient lodgers who populated the growing districts around Notting Hill. Clerks seeking temporary accommodation while searching for permanent situations, seamstresses between positions, travellers waiting for ships to distant colonies, the sort of people whose disappearances might go unnoticed for weeks or months, whose absence would be explained away by sudden departures or changes of fortune. Morrison had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the testimony of former tenants, piecing together a portrait of life within the boarding house that grew more disturbing with each account. Several witnesses spoke of Mrs. Pemberton's peculiar nocturnal habits, her tendency to move about the house at all hours with a heavy tread that seemed to echo through the floorboards. Others mentioned the strange sounds that emanated from the cellar, the occasional smell of lime and something more unpleasant that would drift through the common rooms on particularly still nights. The physical evidence spoke with its own terrible eloquence. The constables working under Morrison's direction had uncovered the remains of at least 7 individuals, their bones scattered in deliberate patterns that suggested both careful planning and a mind operating according to its own twisted logic. The clothing fragments recovered from the shallow graves ranged across several years, some pieces bearing the distinctive buttons and fabrics that had been fashionable in the early 1880s. Each set of remains told a story of trust betrayed, a vulnerability exploited by someone who had turned hospitality into a weapon. Mrs. Pemberton's financial records, seized from her rooms above the boarding house, revealed a pattern of income that far exceeded what her legitimate rental fees should have generated. Bank deposits made with suspicious regularity, always in amounts that suggested the conversion of personal possessions into ready cash. Wedding rings, pocket watches, items of jewellery that might have belonged to tenants who had supposedly departed without notice. The inspector had traced several pieces to pawn shops throughout West London, where Mrs. Pemberton had become a familiar figure over the past decade. The boarding house itself bore the architectural scars of her activities. The cellar had been extensively modified, its original coal storage areas expanded and deepened through what must have been months of careful excavation. The floor had been relayed with particular attention to drainage, channels carved into the stone that led to a sealed cesspit that had been constructed without the knowledge of local authorities. Every aspect of the underground chamber spoke of meticulous preparation, of a mind that had anticipated the practical requirements of concealing multiple murders. Morrison turned his attention to the woman's background, the history that had led her to this moment of reckoning in his office. Adelaide Pemberton had come to London from the industrial towns of the Midlands, carrying with her the sort of hardened pragmatism that characterised those who had survived the worst excesses of factory life. Her husband had died in a foundry accident some 20 years earlier, leaving her with limited resources and fewer options for supporting herself in an economy that offered little mercy to widows of advancing years. The boarding house had represented salvation of a sort, purchased with her husband's modest life insurance settlement, and transformed through her own labour into a respectable establishment. The early years had been marked by legitimate success, her reputation for cleanliness and reasonable rates drawing steady custom from the expanding population of working people who found themselves displaced by London's rapid growth. Somewhere in those years of struggle and gradual prosperity, something fundamental had shifted in her character. The first disappearance that could be definitively traced occurred in the spring of 1883. Thomas Whitmore, a junior clerk seeking employment in the shipping offices along the Thames, had taken a room on the second floor for what he described as a temporary arrangement. His belongings remained in the room for several weeks after his supposed departure, and Mrs. Pemberton had eventually sold them to cover unpaid rent. When Whitmore's brother arrived from Yorkshire to inquire about his whereabouts, she provided a detailed account of his sudden decision to emigrate to Australia, complete with fabricated details about his excitement over opportunities in the colonies. The pattern became refined over the following years. Tenants who paid their rent in advance, who had few local connections, who kept to themselves and rarely received visitors. Mrs. Pemberton developed an instinct for identifying the most vulnerable among her potential lodgers, those whose absence would create the smallest disturbance in the vast indifferent machinery of the metropolitan area. She cultivated relationships with shipping companies and employment agencies, creating plausible explanations for sudden departures that satisfied casual inquiries. The actual mechanics of the murders remained a subject for continued investigation, but certain details had emerged from the physical evidence recovered from the cellar. The poison bottles discovered in Mrs. Pemberton's private quarters suggested a method that avoided the noise and struggle associated with more violent means. Arsenic and strychnine, readily available from rat catchers and agricultural suppliers, administered through meals prepared in the boarding house kitchen. The victims would have experienced their final hours in what they believed to be the safety of their rented rooms, trusting in the maternal solicitude of their landlady. Morrison found himself contemplating the psychology that could sustain such methodical cruelty over years of patient execution. Mrs. Pemberton had continued to operate her establishment as a legitimate business, maintaining the facade of respectability that shielded her true activities from scrutiny. She attended church services at the local Anglican parish, contributed to charitable collections for the poor, participated in the sort of community activities that marked her as a pillar of neighbourhood respectability. The inspector's interview notes from the previous day revealed glimpses of the rationalization that had enabled her crimes. She spoke of her tenants as transients who had chosen to abandon their responsibilities, deserting their rents, and leaving her to manage the consequences of their selfishness. In her mind, she had become the victim of their inconsideration, entitled to compensation from the belongings they left behind. The progression from petty theft to murder appeared to have occurred through gradual steps, each transgression making the next seem less momentous. The autumn afternoon was deepening toward evening when Morrison finally confronted Mrs. Pemberton with the accumulated evidence of her activities. The constables had recovered additional remains from the boarding house garden, their excavations revealing a systematic burial ground that extended beneath the carefully tended flower beds, where she'd grown roses and lavender for the dining room tables. The irony struck the inspector as particularly grotesque. This cultivation of beauty above ground while horror accumulated below. Mrs. Pemberton's confession, when it finally came, possessed the matter-of-fact quality that marked the most disturbing criminal testimonies. She described the practicalities of her methods with the same attention to detail that might characterize a housewife, explaining her approach to preserving seasonal vegetables. The timing of the poisoning to coincide with rent payments, the careful disposal of personal effects to avoid suspicion, the maintenance of detailed records that documented fictitious departures and forwarding addresses. The financial motive had evolved over time from necessity to compulsion, the steady accumulation of wealth from her victims' possessions becoming an end in itself. She had developed elaborate fantasies about eventual retirement to the seaside, perhaps to Brighton or one of the smaller coastal towns where her accumulated capital might support a comfortable dotage. The irony that her crimes had made such peaceful retirement impossible seemed to escape her entirely. As darkness settled over Scotland Yard and the gas lamps flickered to life along the Thames embankment, Morrison completed his preliminary report on the Pemberton case. The paperwork would continue for months. The trial would generate headlines across the empire, and the boarding house on Pembridge Road would become one of those addresses that Londoners spoke of in whispers. But for the inspector, the most haunting aspect of the case lay in its demonstration of how thoroughly evil could disguise itself behind the mask of ordinary respectability. The fog was beginning to gather in the streets beyond his office window, that familiar London phenomenon that seemed to blur the boundaries between the known and unknown, the safe and dangerous. Somewhere in the city's vast sprawl, other Mrs. Pembertons might be serving tea to unsuspecting lodgers, their cellars waiting to receive the next victims of misplaced trust. The case would conclude with legal proceedings that satisfied the demands of justice, but Morrison understood that the true horror lay not in the crimes themselves, but in their revelation of how easily the fabric of civilized society could conceal the most primitive brutality. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave his office, the inspector found himself thinking of the victims whose names they were still working to establish, whose final moments had been spent in the company of someone they had trusted with their lives and safety. The autumn night settled over London like a shroud, and in the distance church bells began to toll the evening hour with their ancient rhythm of comfort and warning. Chapter 4. The Weight of Silence. The morning sun struggled through the grimy windows of the boarding house parlour, casting pale rectangles across the worn Turkish carpet. Inspector Morrison sat hunched over his leather-bound notebook, the pages already thick with observations and sketches from the cellar below. His pen scratched methodically across the parchment, recording each grim detail with the precision of a natural philosopher cataloguing specimens. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 7:30, its brass pendulum catching the weak October light. Mrs. Whitmore, the landlady, had not appeared since the discovery began. Her absence hung in the air like incense gone stale, heavy with unspoken implications. The constables had searched her quarters in the early hours, finding only the ordinary debris of a woman's life, prayer books with worn spines, correspondence from relatives in Yorkshire, a collection of pressed flowers between sheets of tissue paper. Yet something in the careful arrangement of her possessions suggested a mind that ordered the world according to its own hidden logic. Morrison closed his notebook and walked to the window overlooking Ladbroke Grove. The streets stirred with morning commerce, coal wagons rumbling over cobblestones, housemaids hurrying with market baskets, gentlemen in dark overcoats making their way toward the omnibus stops. Life continued its ancient rhythm while 20 feet below. The earth yielded its secrets grain by grain. The inspector had seen death in many forms during his 20 years with the Metropolitan Police. Bodies pulled from the Thames, their faces bloated beyond recognition. Victims of violence in the narrow courts off Whitechapel Road, their blood mixing with autumn rain. The elderly found weeks after their passing, alone in rooms that smelled of lavender and neglect. But the cellar beneath this respectable boarding house presented something different, a methodical arrangement of mortality that spoke to patience rather than passion. Constable Fleming emerged from the cellar entrance, his uniform dusted with earth and something that might have been lime. His face bore the pallor of a man who had spent too many hours breathing air thick with decay. He removed his helmet and ran a sleeve across his forehead, leaving a streak of grime against the pale skin. "Sick so far, Inspector," Fleming reported, his voice steady despite the morning's grim labour. "All skeletal remains, though some retained fragments of clothing and personal effects. Dr. Hartwell believes they've been interred for varying lengths of time, perhaps spanning several years." Morrison nodded, filing away each detail in the compartments of his mind. The police surgeon had arrived before dawn, a thin man with spectacles who approached death with the dispassionate curiosity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. His preliminary examination would continue throughout the morning, each bone and fragment measured and catalogued with scientific precision. The inspector descended the narrow wooden stairs to the cellar, his boots echoing against the stone walls. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, a sweetness that had nothing to do with flowers. Lanterns hung from iron hooks driven into the mortar between bricks, their flames dancing in the underground currents that moved through the foundation like whispered confessions. Dr. Hartwell knelt beside the largest excavation, his hands moving with practiced delicacy as he brushed soil from a skull that had been freed from its earthen shroud. The bone gleamed pale in the lantern light, empty sockets staring toward the low ceiling with an expression that might have been accusation, or merely the eternal silence of the grave. "A young woman, I believe," the surgeon murmured without looking up from his work. "Perhaps 20 years of age when she died." The teeth suggest adequate nutrition during childhood, indicating she likely came from circumstances of modest comfort rather than destitution. Morrison studied the skull, noting how perfectly it had been positioned, face upward, as though the deceased had been laid to rest with deliberate care rather than simply disposed of in haste. The surrounding soil had been disturbed in a rectangular pattern, suggesting the excavation of an actual grave rather than a hasty burial. "The others?" the inspector inquired. "Similar positioning throughout. Each appears to have been interred individually, with space between the graves, most unusual for what one might expect in such circumstances." Dr. Hartwell's voice carried the measured tone of a man accustomed to making observations that would later be repeated in courtrooms, each word weighed for its precision. The constables continued their careful excavation, working by sections to preserve whatever evidence the earth might yield. Fragments of fabric emerged from the soil, wool dyed in shades of brown and grey, cotton that might once have been white, silk ribbon still bearing traces of blue that had faded to the colour of winter sky. A small brass locket surfaced near one of the graves, its surface green with verdigris but still intact enough to suggest it had once held a photograph or lock of hair. Morrison examined each artifact with the methodical attention of an antiquarian studying relics from some vanished civilization. The clothing suggested working-class origins, sturdy fabrics chosen for durability rather than fashion, practical garments that would have served their wearers through long days of labour. Yet the presence of the silk ribbon hinted at small vanities, the human desire to ornament even the most modest existence with touches of beauty. The inspector climbed the cellar stairs and made his way to the first-floor landing, where doors opened onto the rooms that had housed Mrs. Whitmore's tenants. Each chamber told its own story through the accumulation of personal belongings left behind. Books with margins filled in careful copperplate handwriting, letters tied with ribbons and stored in wooden boxes, photographs of families arranged on window sills like domestic altars. Room number 3 had belonged to Miss Sarah Pemberton, a seamstress who had taken lodgings the previous spring. Her possessions remained undisturbed. A sewing basket filled with threads in every shade of the rainbow, patterns cut from newspaper and arranged by season, a small mirror with a frame decorated in painted roses. Her landlady had reported her departure in July, claiming the young woman had returned to her family in Devon after receiving news of an inheritance. Morrison opened the wardrobe and found it empty save for a single glove, grey kid leather worn soft with use. The mate was nowhere to be found, leaving him to wonder whether its absence spoke to the haste of departure or something more sinister. He held the glove to the window light, noting the careful stitching along the fingers and the small pearl button at the wrist, evidence of modest prosperity and attention to detail. The inspector's investigation had revealed that 6 young women had departed Mrs. Whitmore's establishment over the past 3 years, each leaving under circumstances that seemed reasonable enough when viewed individually. Miss Pemberton's inheritance, Miss Crawford's sudden marriage to a gentleman from Birmingham, Miss Fletcher's decision to seek employment in Scotland where wages were said to be higher. Only when considered together did the pattern suggest something other than the ordinary ebb and flow of London's vast population. As the afternoon wore toward evening, Morrison found himself in the boarding-house kitchen, studying the account books Mrs. Whitmore had maintained with meticulous precision. Each entry recorded in the same careful handwriting, rent received, expenses for coal and candles, payments to the butcher and greengrocer. The columns balanced perfectly, every penny accounted for with the obsessive attention of someone for whom order had become a form of prayer. Yet certain entries raised questions that seemed to echo in the silence of the empty house. Payments to J. Sullivan, lime merchant, appeared with surprising regularity, far exceeding what a boarding house of this size would require for ordinary maintenance. Purchases of lye soap in quantities that suggested something beyond normal cleaning. Most curious of all, regular payments to Emma Hartwell Mason for work, described simply as foundation repairs. The inspector's pen paused over this last entry. Monsieur Hartwell, the same surname as the police surgeon currently examining, remains in the cellar below. Morrison made a note to investigate this connection, though he suspected it would prove merely one of those coincidences that seem to multiply around events of unusual darkness, as though the universe conspired to weave patterns of meaning from threads of chance. Evening shadows crept across the parlour as Morrison continued his examination of the boarding-house's secrets. In a drawer beneath Mrs. Whitmore's writing desk, wrapped in oiled cloth like a precious manuscript, he discovered a collection of photographs, portraits of young women arranged with the formal solemnity of memorial cards. Each image bore a name written in the same careful script that filled the account books: Sarah Pemberton, Catherine Crawford, Mary Fletcher, and 3 others whose names he did not recognise. The faces stared out from the albumen prints with the serious expressions that photography demanded, their eyes holding mysteries that death had rendered permanently silent. They wore their best dresses for these portraits, hair carefully arranged and hands folded in poses that suggested both modesty and a quiet dignity. These were not the faces of women who had vanished into London's criminal underworld, but rather those who had hoped for better lives and found instead whatever fate awaited them in the cellar below. As the church bells of St. John's marked the evening hour, Inspector Morrison felt the weight of silence settling over the boarding house like a shroud. The constables had completed their excavation for the day, covering their work with canvas against the damp October air. Dr. Hartwell had departed with his preliminary notes, promising a more complete examination once all remains had been recovered. The inspector stood in the empty parlour, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of lives that had ended in darkness. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, additional testimony from neighbours and tradespeople, perhaps even the apprehension of Mrs. Whitmore herself. But tonight the boarding house kept its own counsel, holding fast to whatever truths lay buried in its foundations like seeds, waiting for a spring that would never come. Morrison locked the front door behind him and stepped into the gaslit street, where fog had begun to gather in pools of yellow light beneath the lamp standards. The ordinary sounds of evening, horses' hooves on cobblestone, the distant whistle of a train, voices calling across the darkness, seemed to come from another world entirely, one where death arrived according to natural law rather than human design. Behind him, the boarding house settled into the stillness of a place where secrets had been disturbed but not yet fully revealed, where the earth itself had become confessor to crimes that daylight had never witnessed. Chapter 5. The Architect of Shadows. The morning fog clung to the windows of the Notting Hill boarding house like funeral shrouds, casting the parlour in grey half-light as Inspector Morrison spread the documents across Mrs. Hartwell's mahogany table. 3 days had passed since the discovery in the cellar, 3 days of methodical excavation that had yielded 7 complete sets of remains and fragments of at least 3 more. The house groaned around them, its Victorian timbers settling under the weight of revelation, each creak seeming to whisper of secrets still buried in its walls. Morrison lifted a leather-bound ledger recovered from a hidden compartment behind the cellar's brick wall. The pages bore the meticulous handwriting of someone who understood that truth, like fine wine, required careful preservation. Each entry detailed not just names and dates, but observations written with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher documenting specimens. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained sharp as surgical instruments. Margaret Ashford, aged 19, arrived November the 13th, 1886, Morrison read aloud to Constable Fletcher, who sat across from him with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. Seeking employment as seamstress. Noted pallor suggests consumption in early stages. Hair auburn, eyes grey. Paid room 3 months advance. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the horsehair upholstery creaking beneath him. Outside, the autumn rain had begun, drumming against the windows with fingers of water that traced crooked paths down the glass. The sound seemed to echo the rhythm of Morrison's voice as he continued reading from the ledger, each entry a life reduced to measurements and observations, catalogued like butterflies pinned into cork. The inspector turned several pages, noting the careful progression of entries through the winter months of 1886 and into the following spring. Between the lodger records pressed flat against the binding were newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Headlines spoke of missing persons, of young women who had vanished from the streets of West London like smoke dispersing in evening air. Morrison recognised several names from the ledger entries, the connection now clear as morning light burning through fog. Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house had operated under various names over the past decade, he had learned from the parish records. The Building of Haven, Mrs. Pemberton's lodging house for respectable women, the Sanctuary of St. Agnes. Each incarnation had lasted precisely 2 years before closing quietly, only to reopen months later under new management with freshly painted signs and different furnishings in the front parlour. Morrison reached for a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, correspondence that had been hidden alongside the ledger. The papers felt brittle between his fingers, as delicate as autumn leaves pressed between pages of scripture. Most bore the letterhead of employment agencies throughout London, recommendations for young women seeking situations as governesses, seamstresses, or companions. The letters painted portraits of respectable girls fallen on difficult circumstances, orphans with modest inheritances, country daughters seeking opportunity in the great city. "Listen to this," Morrison said, unfolding a letter dated April 1887. Miss Catherine Wells comes highly recommended from her previous situation in Yorkshire. She possesses excellent needlework skills and maintains the highest moral character. Her inheritance of £40 makes her independent and reliable. She seeks only modest accommodation while pursuing employment as companion to elderly lady. Fletcher set down his teacup with trembling hands. The constable had grown pale during their morning's work, the reality of their discovery settling upon him like winter frost on bare ground. "Inspector, how many do you suppose there were? How many years did this continue?" Morrison consulted a calendar he had reconstructed from the various documents, marking each known arrival and disappearance with careful precision. The pattern emerged like constellations becoming visible in darkening sky. Young women arrived regularly, usually in autumn and winter months when London's streets grew treacherous and lodgings scarce. They came seeking sanctuary, carrying small inheritances or modest savings that would sustain them during their search for employment. Within weeks, sometimes days, they would disappear as completely as if the earth had opened to swallow them. The ledger revealed the systematic nature of the enterprise. Each woman's financial situation had been carefully assessed, their backgrounds investigated with thoroughness that would have impressed Scotland Yard's finest detectives. Orphans were preferred, particularly those who had recently inherited small sums from deceased relatives. Women estranged from their families, those bearing shame or scandal, proved equally suitable for the landlord's purposes. Morrison discovered architectural drawings folded within the ledger's back pages, detailed plans showing modifications made to the boarding house over successive years. The cellar had been excavated deeper, its walls reinforced with additional brickwork. A complex system of drains had been installed, connecting to the main sewer lines beneath Ladbroke Grove. Most chilling were the annotations in the same careful handwriting, noting optimal depths for concealment and calculations regarding decomposition rates in London's clay soil. The inspector studied these drawings by lamplight, tracing the careful measurements with his finger. Someone had transformed the modest Victorian cellar into something approaching a charnel house, yet maintained the appearance of respectability above ground. The parlour where Morrison now sat had hosted tea parties and evening entertainments, while 20 feet below, the architect of these crimes pursued his dark craft with scientific precision. Constable Fletcher had moved to the window, watching rainwater cascade down the glass in rivulets that caught the grey morning light. "Inspector, what manner of person could live above such horrors? Could take tea with the neighbours while bodies rotted beneath his floorboards?" Morrison considered this question as he continued examining the documents. The evidence suggested someone possessed of unusual intelligence, capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions across many years. The lodging house had operated as a legitimate business, paying taxes and maintaining cordial relationships with local merchants. Neighbours recalled the various proprietors as quiet, respectable individuals who kept excellent gardens and attended church regularly. Yet the ledger revealed a mind that approached murder with the methodical precision of an accountant balancing books. Each victim's death had been carefully planned, timed to coincide with rent payments that would maximise financial gain. Personal belongings were catalogued and sold through networks of dealers who asked few questions about provenance. Bank accounts were systematically emptied through forged documents, prepared with masterful skill. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency, as Morrison discovered a section of the ledger devoted to what appeared to be experimental observations. The handwriting grew smaller, more cramped, as if the author feared even his private records might betray his secrets. Detailed notes described the effects of various poisons, the time required for different methods of disposal, observations about which personal belongings could be safely sold, and which might attract unwanted attention. Morrison felt his stomach turn as he read descriptions of refinements made to the cellar's ventilation system, modifications intended to accelerate decomposition and minimise odours that might alarm other tenants. The author had approached these problems with the systematic thinking of an engineer designing bridges or calculating load-bearing capacities. Fletcher returned to the table, his face grave in the lamplight. "Inspector, I've been thinking about Mrs. Hartwell. She claimed to have purchased this property only 6 months ago, yet some of these bodies have been in the ground much longer." Morrison nodded, turning to examine purchase documents discovered among the papers. The property's ownership had changed hands frequently, always through private sales that left minimal paper trails. Each transaction involved different names, but the same careful handwriting appeared on various contracts and agreements. Someone had been operating under multiple identities, creating an elaborate fiction that allowed him to disappear and re-emerge as needed. The inspector found passport applications, employment references, even testimonial letters from parish vicars, all bearing different names but revealing consistent patterns of forgery. The author had created entire fictional histories for himself, complete with educational credentials and employment records that would satisfy the most thorough investigation. He understood how London's bureaucracy functioned, how proper documents could open doors that would otherwise remain sealed. Among the papers, Morrison discovered correspondence with shipping companies and railway bureau, inquiries about transportation to various destinations throughout the empire. Australia, Canada, South Africa, places where a man with modest capital and proper references might establish himself without excessive scrutiny of his past. The letter suggested careful planning for eventual departure, once the London operation had run its profitable course. The rain had settled into steady rhythm against the windows, creating a curtain of water that obscured the street beyond. Morrison lit another lamp as afternoon shadows began gathering in the parlour's corners. The additional light revealed details previously hidden in the gloom, including a photograph tucked between the ledger's final pages. The image showed a man of perhaps 50 years, dressed in the respectable clothing of a prosperous tradesman or minor professional. His face bore the unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd, neither handsome nor ugly, possessing the bland respectability that marked successful confidence tricksters throughout history. His eyes, however, held something that made Morrison study the photograph more carefully. They possessed the calculating coldness of a predator, assessing potential prey. Fletcher leaned closer to examine the image. "Do you think this is our man, Inspector?" Morrison turned the photograph over, discovering an inscription in the familiar careful handwriting. Thomas Blackwood, proprietor, 1888. Below this, in smaller letters, were the words Memento Mori, followed by what appeared to be a count of numbers, 17 in total. The inspector felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather seeping through the boarding house's windows. 17 victims, if the notation could be trusted. They had discovered only 10 sets of remains, suggesting that 7 more bodies awaited discovery somewhere within the property's bounds. The garden, perhaps, or sealed within the walls themselves. Morrison gathered the documents as afternoon light continued fading beyond the rain-streaked windows. The boarding house seemed to press closer around them, its Victorian architecture taking on sinister aspects in the gathering dusk. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, suggested the building itself was complicit in the horrors it had sheltered. The inspector understood they were dealing with something unprecedented in his experience. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but a calculated enterprise pursued with business-like efficiency across many years. Someone had transformed murder into a profitable trade, selecting victims with the care of a merchant choosing inventory, disposing of evidence with the skill of an experienced undertaker. As Morrison and Fletcher prepared to leave, securing the documents in leather satchels, the inspector paused at the parlour window. Beyond the rain-distorted glass, gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the cobblestone streets of Notting Hill. Ordinary people pursued their evening routines, unaware that they passed daily by a house where such extraordinary evil had flourished. The fog was beginning to gather again, rising from the warming pavements as the rain continued falling. Soon it would envelop the boarding house once more, wrapping it in grey veils that had concealed its secrets for so many years. But the fog could no longer hide what had been brought to light, and Morrison knew that somewhere in London's vast maze of streets, Thomas Blackwood was perhaps already planning his escape from the city that had harboured his crimes. The inspector locked the boarding house door behind them, the iron key turning with finality in the old mechanism. Tomorrow would bring new excavations, new discoveries, and the beginning of a hunt that would take them into London's darkest corners, following the trail of a killer whose careful planning had nearly achieved the perfect crime. Chapter 6. The Landlady's Testament. The pale October dawn crept through the grimy windows of the Notting Hill station house, casting long shadows across Inspector Morrison's desk. The events of the previous night had left their mark upon every man present. The constables who had worked by lantern light in that terrible cellar, the surgeon who had examined the remains with trembling hands, and Morrison himself, who had overseen the methodical excavation of what could only be described as a charnel house beneath the cobblestones of London. Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood sat rigid in the wooden chair before his desk, her black wool dress buttoned to the throat despite the warmth that radiated from the coal brazier in the corner. Her fingers worked constantly at the fabric of her gloves, pulling and smoothing in a rhythm that spoke of nerves stretched beyond their natural limits. The woman who had stood defiant at the cellar stairs mere hours before now appeared diminished, as though the revelation of her boarding house's secrets had physically reduced her stature. Morrison studied her face in the growing light. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with the sharp features and pale complexion common to those who spent their days in London's perpetual twilight. Her dark hair was pulled severely back beneath a black bonnet, and her lips formed a thin line that had not yielded to expression since her arrest. Yet her eyes betrayed her, dark wells that reflected a terrible knowledge, darting constantly between Morrison's face and the door, as though she expected some further horror to manifest itself. The inspector dealt with many killers in his years with the Metropolitan Police. He had learned to read the signs of guilt, the subtle tells that separated the innocent from those who carried blood upon their hands. Mrs. Blackwood possessed all the hallmarks of complicity, yet something in her manner suggested she was not the architect of the crimes that had stained her property with such profound evil. Mrs. Blackwood, Morrison began, his voice carrying the measured tone he had perfected through years of interrogation. The remains we discovered beneath your establishment tell a story of systematic murder, spanning what appears to be several years. 7 bodies, by the surgeon's preliminary count, buried in quicklime and wrapped in canvas that bears the markings of your own linen supplier. The woman's fingers stilled upon her gloves. She raised her eyes to meet his gaze for the first time since entering the room, and Morrison saw within them not defiance, but something far more disturbing. A profound weariness that spoke of secrets carried too long. "Inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things in this world that decent folk are not meant to know, things that live in the spaces between what we call civilized society and the darkness that prowls at its edges." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, sensing that the woman's resolve was beginning to crack like ice beneath spring's first warm breath. "Then tell me, Mrs. Blackwood. Help me understand what transformed your boarding house into a tomb." The October wind rattled the station house windows, and somewhere in the distance the bells of St. Bartholomew's began their morning call to prayer. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes as though the sound caused her physical pain, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of a confession too long suppressed. "It began in the winter of 1885, she said, her voice gaining strength as though the telling itself provided some measure of relief. "I had recently inherited the boarding house from my late husband's estate. The building was old even then, dating to the reign of good Queen Anne, with cellars that stretched deep beneath the street. The previous owner had warned me of strange sounds in the night, of cold spots that never warmed despite the heartiest fire, but I attributed such tales to the superstition common among the ignorant. She paused, drawing a shaking breath. The first tenant arrived on a November evening when the fog lay thick as burial shrouds across the city. He gave his name as Mr. Edmund Carver, and he paid 6 months' rent in advance. Gold sovereigns that gleamed like sin in the lamplight. He was a gentleman of middle years, well-dressed and articulate, with the bearing of one accustomed to authority. Yet there was something about his eyes, Inspector. They held depths that seemed to reflect no light at all. Morrison made careful notes as she spoke, his pen scratching across the paper with mechanical precision. The confession was unfolding with the inexorable quality of a nightmare, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Mr. Carver took the rooms on the second floor, Mrs. Blackwood continued, but from the very first night I heard him moving about at strange hours. The floorboards would creak with his passage long after decent folk had retired, and sometimes I would glimpse him through the windows, crossing the courtyard with packages wrapped in dark cloth. When I inquired about his profession, he claimed to be a natural philosopher, conducting research into the hidden properties of matter. The woman's fingers resumed their restless motion, pulling at her gloves as though trying to remove some invisible stain. The other tenants began to complain within a fortnight of his arrival. Mrs. Pemberton in the ground floor room spoke of voices that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. Not conversation, Inspector, but something far more disturbing. A sound like prayers spoken in reverse, words that made the very air feel cold and heavy. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. The details of Mrs. Blackwood's account matched too closely the reports he'd received from neighbours in the weeks leading up to the discovery. The Notting Hill district had always harboured its share of eccentrics and outcasts, but something about the Carver case suggested malevolence of an entirely different order. Young Mr. Hartwell, who occupied the third floor, Mrs. Blackwood continued, began to suffer from terrible nightmares. He would wake screaming in the small hours, claiming that invisible hands sought to drag him down through the very floor. Within a month, he'd grown so thin and pale that he resembled a consumptive, though the court physician could find no sign of disease. She stopped speaking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Morrison waited patiently, understanding that the woman was approaching the heart of her terrible tale. Outside, the city was awakening to another day, the sounds of horses and cart wheels on cobblestones creating a reassuring backdrop of normalcy that seemed to exist in another world entirely. "It was on Christmas Eve," she whispered, "when I first discovered what Mr. Carver truly was. I had remained late in the parlour, wrapping small gifts for the tenants, a tradition my dear husband had begun in better days." The house was quiet, save for the settling of old timber and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Then I heard it, Inspector, the sound of digging coming from somewhere deep beneath the building. Morrison's pen paused above the paper. "You investigated this sound?" "I took a candle and descended to the cellar," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. The sound grew louder as I approached, a rhythmic scraping that spoke of systematic excavation. When I reached the cellar proper, I discovered that Mr. Carver had removed several of the flagstones and was engaged in digging what could only be described as a grave. The inspector felt his blood grow cold. And what was Mr. Carver burying, Mrs. Blackwood? The woman's eyes filled with tears that she made no effort to wipe away. At first, I thought it was refuse from his experiments, bundles wrapped in canvas and secured with a rope. But as I watched from the shadows, one of the packages shifted, and I saw protruding from the wrapping what was unmistakably a human hand, white as marble in the candlelight. Morrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, struggling to process the implications of her words. If Mrs. Blackwood spoke truthfully, she had witnessed the disposal of murder victims and done nothing to alert the authorities. Yet her manner suggested not complicity, but something far more troubling, a kind of supernatural terror that had paralysed her ability to act. "Why did you not report these observations to the police?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal depths of horror he was not prepared to contemplate. Mrs. Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humour. Because when I attempted to retreat to my rooms, Mr. Carver called to me from the darkness. He had known of my presence all along, Inspector. He spoke without turning from his work, his voice carrying a quality that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly within one's very bones. She shuddered at the memory. He told me that I had become a witness to necessities beyond common understanding, that his work served purposes that transcended the moral limitations of ordinary souls. He explained that the boarding house sat upon ground that had been consecrated to older gods, deities whose names were whispered in the shadows long before Christ brought his light to Britain's shores. Morrison felt the rational foundations of his worldview beginning to shift beneath him. Mrs. Beast, Blackwood's account possessed the ring of truth, yet it described events that challenged everything he understood about the nature of crime and criminals. The inspector had always prided himself on his ability to reduce even the most bizarre cases to matters of human greed, passion, or madness. This case seemed to operate according to entirely different principles. Mr. Carver made me understand, she continued, that attempting to interfere with his activities would result in consequences far worse than death. He showed me things, Inspector, artifacts from his collection that seemed to pulse with malevolent life, symbols carved into the cellar walls that hurt to look upon directly. He demonstrated that he possessed knowledge of the ancient arts, power over forces that decent Christians dare not acknowledge. The woman fell silent, staring at her hands as though seeing blood upon them that no amount of washing could remove. Morrison waited, sensing that the worst of her revelations was yet to come. "For 4 years," she whispered, "I lived with the knowledge of what transpired beneath my roof. Tenants would arrive with hope in their hearts, seeking affordable lodgings in London's great sprawl. Mr. Carver would select those who would not be missed, travellers without family, immigrants seeking new lives, unfortunates fleeing debt or disgrace. He would befriend them, gain their trust, then lead them down into the cellars where his true work awaited." Morrison resumed taking notes, though his hand trembled slightly as he wrote. "And you never attempted to warn these victims?" "I tried, Inspector. God knows I tried. But Mr. Trumber, Carver's influence extended beyond mere threat. Those he marked for his purposes seemed to fall under a kind of enchantment. They would hear his voice calling from the cellars and descend willingly, as though drawn by forces beyond their control. And I found that when I attempted to speak of what I had witnessed, the words would not come. My tongue would cleave to the roof of my mouth, and a terrible pressure would build behind my eyes until I feared my very skull might crack." The confession was drawing to its close, and Morrison could sense that Mrs. Blackwood was nearing the limits of her endurance. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting warming rays through the station house windows, but the light seemed unable to dispel the shadows that had gathered around their conversation. "What became of Mr. Carver?" the inspector asked. Mrs. Blackwood raised her eyes to meet his gaze one final time. 3 weeks ago he simply vanished. I went to collect the rent and found his rooms empty, as though he had never existed at all. The cellar was sealed with fresh mortar, and a terrible silence had settled over the entire building. I thought perhaps the nightmare had ended, that I might at last find peace. She smiled then, an expression so filled with bitter irony that Morrison felt his heart constrict with pity. "But the dead do not rest quietly, Inspector. They whisper in the walls, calling for justice that living souls are powerless to provide. That is why I sent the anonymous letter that brought you to my door. I could no longer bear the weight of my silence." The clock on Morrison's desk chimed the half-hour, its melodic notes seeming to echo from another world where such conversations were merely the stuff of penny dreadfuls and ghost stories. Mrs. Blackwood sat perfectly still, her confession complete, waiting for whatever judgment the inspector might pronounce. Morrison closed his notebook and regarded the woman with a mixture of professional duty and human compassion. Whatever else she might be, Mrs. Blackwood was clearly as much a victim as those who lay buried beneath her property. The case would require investigation far beyond the normal scope of police work, delving into mysteries that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. The hunt for Edmund Carver would begin immediately, though Morrison suspected they were pursuing a quarry unlike any the Metropolitan Police had ever encountered. Chapter 7. The Weight of Earth and Conscience. The autumn of 1889 had settled over London like a shroud, thick and unforgiving. The fog that pressed against the cellar windows of the Notting Hill boarding house seemed to whisper of secrets long buried, of truths that clawed their way toward light despite human efforts to keep them hidden. Inspector Morrison's lantern cast dancing shadows across the brick walls, each flicker revealing another fragment of what lay beneath the carefully swept floor. The earth gave up its treasures reluctantly, grain by grain, bone by bone. Mrs. Hartwell remained at the foot of the cellar stairs, her black bombazine dress rustling with each nervous shift of her weight. The landlady's face had grown pale as parchment in the lamplight, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of words she dared not utter. Behind her, the autumn wind rattled the windows of the boarding house above, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant tolling of church bells that marked the passing hours of this endless night. Morrison's constables worked with the methodical precision of men who had learned to face the darker truths of human nature. Sergeant Blackwood, his uniform darkened with earth and perspiration, carefully lifted each shovelful of soil into a wooden crate. The younger constable, Phillips, held the lantern steady despite the tremor in his hands. He had joined the Metropolitan Police only months before, drawn by promises of justice and order. The reality of what lay beneath London's civilized veneer proved far different from his expectations. The first complete skeleton emerged as the night deepened. The bones lay in curious arrangement, not the natural disorder of a hastily dug grave, but positioned with deliberate care. The skull faced east, toward the rising sun that would never warm these hollow sockets again. The arms crossed over the ribcage in an attitude of prayer or resignation. Around the neck, a chain of tarnished silver caught the lantern light, its links green with age and dampness. Morrison knelt beside the remains, his practiced eye cataloguing details that would later fill the pages of official reports. The bones bore the delicate structure of a woman, perhaps 20 years of age when death claimed her. Fragments of cloth clung to the skeleton, once fine fabric now reduced to mere threads. The style of dress, what remained visible, suggested the fashion of perhaps 5 years past. A small silver locket lay among the ribs, its surface corroded but still bearing the faint outline of engraved flowers. The inspector's fingers worked carefully at the locket's clasp, years of experience teaching him patience in such moments. Inside, protected by the silver casing, a miniature portrait gazed up at him. The face belonged to a young woman with dark eyes and gentle features, her hair arranged in the elaborate style favoured by ladies of modest means. On the opposite side of the locket, an inscription in flowing script: "To dearest Catherine, with love eternal, Mother." Mrs. Hartwell's sharp intake of breath echoed through the cellar. Morrison lifted his gaze to find the landlady staring at the locket with recognition dawning in her pale eyes. Her knuckles whitened further against the wooden banister, and her lips moved silently as if forming words she could not bring herself to speak aloud. The name Catherine stirred memories in Morrison's methodical mind. 3 months prior, a young woman of that name had been reported missing by her family in Whitechapel. Catherine Mills, aged 19, employed as a seamstress in a factory near the Thames. She had left her lodgings one morning in June, promising her landlady she would return before evening with the week's rent. The summer days had stretched long and hopeful then, filled with the promise of warm nights and gentle rain. Catherine Mills had walked into that bright morning and vanished as completely as morning mist. The search for Catherine had consumed weeks of police effort. Her family, poor but respectable, had pleaded with every official who would listen. Her mother, a widow who took in washing to support her remaining children, had walked the streets of London calling her daughter's name until her voice grew hoarse and her feet bled through her worn boots. The investigation had yielded nothing but false hopes and dead ends. Catherine Mills had joined the countless others who disappeared into London's vast embrace, leaving behind only questions and grief. Now, in this damp cellar beneath a boarding house in Notting Hill, Catherine's story found its grim conclusion. The silver locket spoke of a mother's love, of hopes and dreams that had died with the young woman who wore it. The careful positioning of the remains suggested something beyond mere murder, a ritualistic element that chilled Morrison's blood despite his years of experience with London's darker crimes. Sergeant Blackwood's voice broke the heavy silence. "Inspector, there's more here." The second set of remains lay deeper in the earth, positioned with the same deliberate care as the first. These bones belonged to an older woman, her frame suggesting hard labour and poor nutrition. The skull showed signs of violence, a depression along the left temple that spoke of a heavy blow. Unlike Catherine's remains, this skeleton wore no jewellery, bore no identifying marks save for the brutality of her death. As the constables worked to uncover the second burial, Morrison studied the cellar's architecture. The boarding house above dated from the early part of the century, built when Notting Hill still retained traces of its rural past. The cellar walls showed signs of recent excavation, newer mortar between certain bricks where repairs had been made. Someone had taken considerable care to conceal these graves, to ensure they remained hidden beneath the daily commerce of life above. Mrs. Hartwell's testimony from earlier in the evening echoed through Morrison's thoughts. She had owned the boarding house for 7 years, inheriting it from her deceased husband's estate. The cellar had always been used for storage, she claimed, filled with the accumulated possessions of tenants who had moved on without collecting their belongings. She insisted she rarely ventured below ground, leaving such duties to the daily girl who came to manage the heavy work. Yet the condition of the graves spoke of recent activity. Someone with intimate knowledge of the boarding house's routine had dug these resting places, had arranged the bodies with ceremonial care, had sealed the earth above them with practiced skill. The work bore the marks of someone who understood both the house's rhythms and the needs of concealment. Phillips raised his lantern higher, casting its glow across the cellar's far corners. In the strengthened light, Morrison noticed details that had escaped earlier observation. Scratches along the brick walls formed crude symbols, carved with desperate haste. Numbers and letters intertwined in patterns that suggested either madness or meaning beyond conventional understanding. Among the markings, dates emerged from the shadows. June 1889, March 1888, October 1887. The timeline stretched backward through months and years, each date potentially marking another tragedy hidden beneath London's streets. Morrison felt the familiar weight of investigation settling upon his shoulders, the burden of truths that demanded justice regardless of their horror. Each symbol carved into the cellar walls represented someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose absence had left wounds that would never fully heal. The third set of remains emerged as the church bells marked the approach of dawn. These bones belonged to the youngest victim yet discovered, a girl perhaps 16 years old when death claimed her. The skeleton lay curled in an attitude of sleep, arms wrapped around what remained of a small cloth bundle. Morrison's careful examination revealed the bundle's contents: a few coins, a brass thimble, and a letter written in a childish hand. The letter, though stained with moisture and age, remained partially legible. It spoke of hope and homesickness, of a young girl's dreams of returning to her family in the countryside once she'd earned enough money in London's factories. The signature, though faded, appeared to read, "Your loving daughter, Mary." Mrs. Hartwell had grown increasingly agitated as each discovery emerged from the earth. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders despite the cellar's warmth, her breathing shallow and rapid. When Morrison approached her with questions about the dates carved into the walls, her responses became evasive, her eyes darting toward the cellar stairs as if calculating her chances of escape. The inspector's patient questioning gradually extracted fragments of truth from the landlady's reluctant lips. Yes, she remembered young women who had taken rooms in the boarding house over the years. Yes, some had left without notice, abandoning their possessions and disappearing into London's anonymous crowds. No, she'd never thought to contact the police about their sudden departures. Such behaviour was common among the city's working poor, she insisted. People who moved frequently in search of better opportunities or to escape debts and troubles. As dawn approached, Morrison made the decision that would transform the investigation from a simple missing person case into something far more complex and disturbing. The boarding house would be sealed, its remaining tenants relocated, while a thorough search revealed whatever other secrets lay hidden within its walls. Mrs. Hartwell would be taken into custody for questioning. Her evasive answers and obvious knowledge of the cellar's contents marking her as either perpetrator or accomplice in crimes that stretched back years. The constables wrapped the remains in clean linen, preparing them for transport to the morgue, where medical examination might reveal additional details about the manner of their deaths. Each skeleton would be photographed, measured and analysed with the methodical precision that characterised Victorian investigation. The personal effects found with each victim would be catalogued and preserved, potential evidence in trials yet to come. Morrison extinguished his lantern as natural light began to filter through the cellar windows. The fog that had pressed so heavily against the glass throughout the night was lifting, revealing the grey promise of another London morning. Above them, the boarding house remained silent, its remaining occupants unaware of the horrors that had been concealed beneath their feet. The inspector climbed the cellar stairs, leaving behind the damp earth and its grim revelations. Behind him, the shadows seemed to whisper of justice delayed but not denied, of truths that would demand answers regardless of the passage of time. The investigation into the Notting Hill boarding house had only begun, but already Morrison sensed they had uncovered something far more extensive than a simple crime of opportunity. As the morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across London's awakening streets, the boarding house prepared to surrender more of its secrets to those who had the courage to seek them. Chapter 8. The Landlady's Testament. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the Notting Hill station house, casting pale rectangles across the wooden floor where Mrs. Edith Blackwood sat with her hands folded in her lap. The fog had lifted during the night, revealing a London washed clean by autumn rain, but here in the cramped interview room, the air still carried the weight of yesterday's revelations. Inspector Morrison studied the woman across from him, noting how her once proud posture had crumbled into something resembling defeat. Mrs. Blackwood had maintained her boarding house at number 47 Ladbroke Grove for nearly 2 decades, establishing herself as a pillar of respectability in a neighbourhood that balanced precariously between genteel aspiration and working-class reality. Her establishment catered to clerks and shopkeepers, travelling salesmen and minor government functionaries, men of modest means who required clean rooms and regular meals at reasonable rates. She had built her reputation on discretion and order, advertising in the better newspapers and accepting only references from previous landlords or employers. The discovery in her cellar had shattered that carefully constructed facade. Morrison had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the evidences constables had methodically excavated from beneath the boarding house. 7 bodies, perhaps 8. The remains were in various stages of decomposition, making precise counts difficult. The oldest appeared to have been interred for several years, while the most recent showed signs of burial within the past few months. All appeared to be men of middle years, their clothing suggesting the same class of tenant that Mrs. Blackwood typically accommodated. Sergeant Willis entered the room carrying a tea service on a tarnished tray. The gesture seemed almost absurdly civilised given the circumstances, but Morrison had learned that maintaining certain courtesies often encouraged cooperation from reluctant witnesses. Mrs. Blackwood accepted her cup with trembling hands, the delicate china rattling against the saucer as she lifted it to her lips. Morrison had awakened before dawn to review the boarding house records that his men had confiscated. The ledger books revealed a pattern of short-term residents who had arrived with luggage and departed, according to Mrs. Blackwood's entries, in the middle of the night or early morning hours. The departures were always sudden, often accompanied by notes indicating the tenant had received urgent summons elsewhere. A sick relative in Manchester, a business opportunity in Birmingham, employment prospects in Dublin. The timing struck Morrison as suspicious. Such convenient coincidences deserved scrutiny. The inspector opened his notebook and consulted the names he had compiled. Mr. Thomas Henley, a travelling representative for a textile firm, had taken rooms in March and reportedly departed for Glasgow 3 days later. Mr. Charles Wickham, a clerk from the post office, had stayed barely a week before receiving word of his father's illness in Yorkshire. Mr. Edmund Foster, whose occupation Mrs. Blackwood listed as gentleman of independent means, had vanished after a single night, leaving behind what the landlady described as a substantial trunk of personal effects. Mrs. Blackwood sipped her tea and gazed through the window at the street beyond. Her grey hair, normally arranged in an elaborate coiffure, hung loose around her shoulders, and her black wool dress showed wrinkles from the previous night's ordeal. She had aged a decade in the space of 12 hours, the weight of discovery transforming her from a respectable businesswoman into something approaching a broken creature. Morrison began with gentle questions about the boarding house operations. Mrs. Blackwood described her daily routine, rising at 5:30 to prepare breakfast, checking the dining room throughout the day, maintaining the common areas, collecting rent on Fridays. She employed a single servant girl, young Mary Dunning, who assisted with cleaning and laundry. The girl lived out, returning each evening to her family's lodgings in Paddington, an arrangement that Mrs. Blackwood claimed provided necessary economy. The inspector pressed for details about the cellar. Mrs. Blackwood insisted she rarely descended below the ground floor, leaving such matters to Mary, or occasionally venturing down herself when absolutely necessary. The space served primarily for storage. Coal for the heating, preserved foods, linens, and household supplies. She claimed to have noticed the peculiar odours only recently, attributing them initially to problems with the sewerage system that plagued much of the district. Morrison studied her responses carefully, noting inconsistencies and evasions. Mrs. Blackwood claimed complete ignorance about the burials, yet the condition of the remains suggested they had been interred over an extended period. The positioning of the bodies indicated methodical placement rather than hasty concealment. Someone had taken considerable care to arrange the deceased in neat rows, covering each with lime and earth in quantities that suggested prior experience with such grisly work. The financial record painted an intriguing picture. Mrs. Blackwood's banking statements, seized during the search of her private rooms, showed regular deposits that exceeded what her legitimate rental income should have generated. The amounts were modest but consistent, £5 here, £10 there, sums that accumulated over time into substantial reserves. She maintained accounts at 3 different banks, an unusual arrangement for someone of her apparent social standing. Morrison questioned her about specific tenants. Mrs. Blackwood's memory proved remarkably selective. She recalled minute details about some residents, while claiming complete ignorance about others. She could describe Mr. Henley's preference for kippers at breakfast, and his habit of reading the morning papers aloud, yet professed to know nothing about his background or family connections. Her recollections of Mr. Wickham focused on his punctuality and neat appearance, but she seemed genuinely surprised when Morrison mentioned the man's employment at the post office. The inspector's suspicions crystallized around the missing personal effects. Mrs. Blackwood claimed that departed tenants occasionally left behind belongings, forgotten clothes, books, small personal items of negligible value. She had stored such abandoned property in the cellar, she explained, hoping the owners might eventually return to claim them. Yet the constables had found no such storage area during their excavation, only the carefully arranged burial sites and undisturbed sections of earth floor. As the morning progressed, Mrs. Blackwood's composure began to crack. The steady progression of Morrison's questions seemed to wear down her defences, and she began volunteering information without prompting. She spoke of sleepless nights when she heard sounds from below. Footsteps, she claimed, or perhaps the settling of old timbers. She described dreams that left her exhausted. Visions of men walking through her halls long after midnight, their faces pale and eyes accusing. Morrison recognized the signs of guilt seeking absolution through confession. He had encountered similar behavior in previous cases, criminals who maintained innocence until the weight of evidence broke their resolve, then sought relief through admission. Mrs. Blackwood appeared to be approaching such a moment, her carefully constructed denials becoming more desperate with each passing hour. The breakthrough came when Morrison produced a leather wallet recovered from one of the graves. The item belonged to Mr. Foster, the gentleman of independent means who had supposedly departed after a single night. Inside, the constables had found £23 in banknotes and a photograph of a young woman signed, "To dearest Edmund, with all my love, Catherine." The wallet's presence in the burial site directly contradicted Mrs. Blackwood's claim that Mr. Foster had departed voluntarily. Confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Blackwood's facade finally crumbled. She pressed her hands to her face and began to weep, her body shaking with suppressed sobs that seemed to rise from some deep reservoir of guilt and fear. Morrison waited patiently, understanding that this moment would determine whether his investigation advanced or stalled in legal technicalities and continued denials. Through her tears, Mrs. Blackwood began to speak in fragments. She mentioned loneliness, the burden of maintaining her establishment without assistance, the constant worry about money and reputation. She spoke of men who arrived at her boarding house carrying wealth that seemed disproportionate to their apparent circumstances, clerks with expensive watches, travelling salesmen with rolls of banknotes, gentlemen of modest bearing who carried gold sovereigns in their waistcoats. Morrison listened as the story emerged in broken pieces. Mrs. Blackwood described her growing awareness that some tenants represented opportunities rather than merely customers, men travelling alone, without family connections or business associates expecting their arrival, carrying more money than their situations warranted. She spoke of sleepless nights spent contemplating the unfairness of her circumstances, working constantly to maintain respectability while others seemed blessed with unearned advantages. The inspector began to understand the twisted logic that had guided Mrs. Blackwood's actions. She had convinced herself that certain tenants deserved their fate, that their wealth was somehow ill-gotten or inappropriate to their stations. She rationalized her crimes as corrections to cosmic injustice, taking from men who possessed more than they merited and using their resources to maintain her own precarious position in society. As the confession continued, Morrison realized he was confronting not a calculating killer but a woman whose desperation had gradually corrupted her moral compass. Mrs. Blackwood described the first incident as almost accidental, a disagreement with Mr. Henley about rent that had escalated when she discovered the substantial sum he carried. She claimed self-defense, though her description of events suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. The subsequent murders had followed a similar pattern. Mrs. Blackwood would identify tenants who appeared to carry significant wealth, then create opportunities for private confrontation. She favoured late evening encounters in the boarding house's lower floors, away from other residents who might hear sounds of struggle. Her method involved poisoning, quantities of arsenic mixed into cocoa or evening meals, followed by burial in the cellar during the pre-dawn hours when the neighbourhood lay sleeping. Morrison understood that Mrs. Blackwood's confession represented only the beginning of his investigation. He would need to verify her claims, identify the victims properly, and establish timelines for each murder. The legal proceedings would require extensive documentation and witness testimony, assuming other residents could provide useful information about the deceased tenants and their mysterious disappearances. As the church bells of Notting Hill announced the noon hour, Inspector Morrison closed his notebook and prepared to formally charge Mrs. Edith Blackwood with multiple counts of murder. The woman who had spent 20 years building a reputation for respectability had revealed herself as something far more sinister, a predator who had turned her boarding house into an elaborate trap for unsuspecting victims. The autumn afternoon stretched ahead, filled with the grim work of excavation and identification, of notifying families and pursuing justice for the dead. But Morrison felt the satisfaction that came with breakthrough moments in difficult cases, the relief of understanding replacing the frustration of mystery, the promise of resolution emerging from weeks of patient investigation. Chapter 9. The Testimony of Broken Stone. The basement of the Notting Hill boarding house revealed its secrets reluctantly, like a penitent forced to confession after years of silence. Inspector Morrison's lantern cast wavering circles of amber light across the excavation site, where his constables worked with the methodical precision of archaeologists uncovering some ancient burial ground. Each scrape of their spades against the packed earth brought forth new evidence of the horrors that had unfolded beneath the feet of unsuspecting lodgers above. The first complete skeleton emerged on the third day of digging, its bones arranged with an unsettling deliberateness that spoke of ritual rather than mere disposal. Morrison knelt beside the remains, studying the positioning of the arms crossed over the chest, the careful placement of small personal effects around the body. A tarnished locket lay open beside the skull, revealing the faded daguerreotype of a young woman whose identity would forever remain unknown. The skeleton wore the remnants of a dark wool dress, its fabric preserved by the peculiar chemistry of the cellar's soil. Mrs. Hartwell, the boarding house proprietress, had maintained her innocence with the fervour of a martyr, insisting that her establishment had housed nothing more sinister than travelling merchants and clerks seeking affordable lodgings. Yet the evidence mounting in her basement told a different story entirely. The constables had uncovered not one but 7 distinct burial sites, each marked by the same ritualistic arrangement of personal belongings and the same careful orientation of the bodies toward the eastern wall of the cellar. The autumn of 1889 had settled over London like a shroud, bringing with it the familiar fog that transformed the city's streets into mysterious corridors of shadow and gaslight. The boarding house stood on Pembridge Crescent, a respectable address that had attracted middle-class tenants seeking proximity to Hyde Park while maintaining a modest distance from the more fashionable districts of Kensington. The building itself dated to the 1840s, constructed during the Great Expansion that had transformed Notting Hill from rural farmland into a thriving residential quarter. Morrison examined the cellar's architecture with growing unease. The original foundation had been modified extensively, with new brick walls creating a series of smaller chambers branching off from the main basement. These additions showed skilled craftsmanship, suggesting that someone had invested considerable time and expense in creating this subterranean labyrinth. The mortar between the newer bricks bore a distinctive reddish tint that proved, upon closer inspection, to contain traces of human blood mixed with the traditional lime and sand. The inspector's investigation had begun 3 weeks earlier when a concerned sister arrived from Yorkshire, seeking news of her brother who had taken lodgings at Mrs. Hartwell's establishment the previous spring. Thomas Whitmore had written faithfully to his family for months, his letters describing his work as a clerk in a Bayswater counting house and his satisfaction with his comfortable rooms on the boarding house's second floor. Then, abruptly, the correspondence had ceased. His sister's inquiries to Mrs. Hartwell had yielded only vague explanations about unexpected departures and forwarding addresses that proved to be fictitious. The first sweep of the building had revealed nothing immediately suspicious. Mrs. Hartwell presented herself as a respectable widow, maintaining her establishment with the help of an elderly housemaid named Sarah Briggs. The lodgers currently in residence spoke favourably of their accommodations, though several mentioned an unpleasant odour that seemed to emanate from the lower floors during warm weather. Mrs. Hartwell attributed this to the building's proximity to the Westbourne, the underground river that flowed beneath Paddington and frequently caused drainage problems in the area's basements. It was the housemaid Sarah Briggs who eventually provided the key to unlocking the boarding house's dark secrets. Confronted with Morrison's patient questioning and increasingly suspicious observations, the elderly woman's resolve crumbled like ancient parchment. She spoke of Mrs. Hartwell's peculiar nocturnal activities, of heavy sacks carried down to the cellar in the darkest hours before dawn, of lime purchased in quantities far exceeding any reasonable household need. Sarah's testimony revealed a pattern that had continued for nearly 3 years. Mrs. Hartwell would select certain lodgers with particular care, choosing men who travelled alone, who had few local connections, who paid their rent in advance and spoke little of their backgrounds. These chosen tenants would disappear quietly, their belongings packed away, and their rooms prepared for new occupants within days of their last sighting. Mrs. Hartwell always had plausible explanations for these sudden departures, stories of family emergencies or business opportunities that required immediate relocation. The excavation of the cellar floor had begun after Morrison's team discovered traces of quicklime beneath the building's main staircase. The lime had been spread thick in certain areas, clearly intended to accelerate decomposition and mask the odour of decay. Yet the very thoroughness of Mrs. Hartwell's efforts had preserved evidence of her crimes, creating a chronological record written in bone and personal effects. Each burial site told its own tragic story. The second skeleton belonged to a younger man, his remains accompanied by a pocket watch bearing the inscription, "To William on his 21st birthday," and a bundle of unopened letters tied with black ribbon. The third grave contained an elderly gentleman whose false teeth had survived the decades underground, still bearing the mark of a Harley Street dentist. A fourth excavation revealed the remains of a middle-aged woman, her body accompanied by a small leather prayer book and a silver wedding ring that suggested she had been among the few female victims. Morrison pieced together Mrs. Hartwell's methodology through careful examination of the evidence and Sarah Briggs's increasingly detailed confessions. The landlady had employed a combination of poison and physical violence, selecting her methods based on the circumstances of each individual case. Several skulls showed evidence of blunt force trauma, while others displayed no obvious signs of violence, suggesting the use of toxins that would leave no easily detectable traces. The inspector discovered that Mrs. Hartwell had maintained meticulous records of her crimes, keeping a ledger hidden behind a loose brick in the cellar wall. The book contained names, dates, and brief descriptions of her victims, along with inventories of their personal possessions and the monetary value realized from selling their belongings. The entries revealed a business-like approach to murder that chilled Morrison more than any display of passion or madness might have done. The ledger's pages documented nearly 40 victims over a span of 5 years, though the cellar excavation suggested that Mrs. Hartwell had been even more prolific in her deadly enterprise. Many of the earlier graves had been disturbed and their contents removed, possibly when the basement's configuration had been modified to accommodate the growing number of bodies. The inspector realised that they might never know the full extent of Mrs. Hartwell's crimes. The boarding house's other residents had been evacuated as the investigation expanded, their shocked testimonies revealing the ordinary facade that had concealed such extraordinary evil. They spoke of Mrs. Hartwell as a model landlady, attentive to her tenants' needs while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She had prepared hearty meals, kept the common areas clean and comfortable, and charged reasonable rents that attracted a steady stream of respectable lodgers. Yet beneath this veneer of domestic respectability, Mrs. Hartwell had operated with the cold efficiency of a practiced predator. The basement modifications had been completed during the establishment's quieter winter months, when fewer lodgers occupied the upper floors and the sounds of construction could be attributed to routine maintenance. She had cultivated relationships with local tradesmen who asked no awkward questions about her frequent lime purchases or her request for discreet disposal of furniture and personal effects. Morrison's investigation revealed that Mrs. Hartwell had been born Millicent Godfrey in Whitechapel, the daughter of a rag and bone merchant who had died in debtor's prison when she was 16. She had worked as a domestic servant in several respectable households, before marrying Albert Hartwell, a railway clerk whose modest inheritance had provided the capital to purchase the Notting Hill boarding house. Albert's death from consumption in 1885 had left his widow with property but little ready money, creating the financial pressures that may have driven her to murder. The autumn investigation stretched into November as Morrison's team worked to identify the victims and notify their families. Many of the dead had been transients or immigrants with few local connections, making the task of identification particularly challenging. Letters found among their possessions provided clues to distant relatives who had wondered at the sudden cessation of correspondence from London. Mrs. Bree. Hartwell maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that Sarah Briggs had acted independently and that she herself had been unaware of the crimes occurring beneath her own roof. Yet the physical evidence contradicted her assertions at every turn. Her fingerprints were found on the murder weapons recovered from the cellar, and her handwriting matched that in the deadly ledger. The basement's architectural modifications required knowledge of the building's structure that only the owner could possess. The case attracted considerable attention from London's newspapers, which sensationalised the story as the Notting Hill Horror, and drew uncomfortable parallels to other recent crimes that had shocked the city's residents. The boarding house murders revealed the vulnerability of London's transient population. The thousands of clerks and tradesmen who lived in rented rooms far from family and friends who might notice their disappearance. As winter settled over the excavation site, Morrison supervised the careful removal of the remaining evidence. Each skeleton was photographed and catalogued before being transported to the mortuary for further examination. The personal effects were cleaned and preserved, creating a melancholy museum of interrupted lives and abandoned dreams. The boarding house itself stood empty as the investigation concluded, its windows boarded and its door sealed with official notices. Local residents spoke of strange sounds emanating from the building during the dark hours before dawn, though Morrison attributed such reports to the natural settling of a structure that had been disturbed by months of excavation. The November fog pressed against the cellar windows as the last of the evidence was removed, and somewhere in the darkness above, the church bells of St. John's marked the passing hours with their measured bronze voices. The basement lay empty at last, its secrets finally exposed to the pale London daylight that struggled through the grimy glass. Yet questions remained unanswered, shadows that would follow the case long after Mrs. Hartwell faced the judgment of court and crown, carrying with them the weight of lives cut short and stories left forever untold. Chapter 10. The Weight of Silence. The final shovelful of earth fell away with a whisper of disturbed dust, and Inspector Morrison found himself staring into the hollow sockets of what had once been a human face. The skull lay tilted at an unnatural angle, its jaw agape in what seemed an eternal scream, though no sound had passed those lips for months, perhaps years. The constables stepped back instinctively, their lanterns casting dancing shadows that made the bones appear to shift and writhe in the cramped cellar beneath the Notting Hill boarding house. Above them, through 20 feet of timber and stone, the fog of that October evening in 1889 pressed against the windows like curious spirits seeking entry. The city of London slumbered fitfully, unaware that one of its darkest secrets was finally surrendering itself to the light. Morrison knelt beside the excavation, his weathered hands steady despite the horror before him. He'd seen death in many forms during his 30 years with the Metropolitan Police, but there was something about this particular discovery that settled cold and heavy in his chest like winter fog. The landlady, Mrs. Edith Harrow, remained frozen at the cellar stairs, her face pale as parchment in the lamplight. She had maintained her innocence throughout the evening's proceedings, insisting that the complaints from her tenants were nothing more than the imaginings of nervous minds and the natural settling of an old building. But the evidence now emerging from the earth beneath her property spoke with a voice more terrible than any testimony she might offer. Constable Barnes approached the inspector with careful steps, his youth evident in the tremor of his hands as he held his notebook. The young man had joined the force only months earlier, and Morrison could see the shock of discovery written plainly across his features. The seasoned inspector remembered his own first encounter with murder most foul, how the reality of human evil had struck him like a physical blow, leaving him questioning the very nature of civilization itself. The examination revealed more than a single victim. As the constables continued their methodical excavation under Morrison's watchful eye, additional remains emerged from the disturbed earth. Fragments of clothing suggested victims from different seasons, different years perhaps. A woman's hairpin, tarnished black with age. A man's pocket watch, its hands frozen at 11:30. Though whether morning or evening no one could say, the detritus of interrupted lives lay scattered like fallen leaves, each piece a testament to dreams cut short and futures stolen. Mrs. Harrow's boarding house had stood on Ladbroke Grove for nearly 2 decades, weathering the transformation of Notting Hill from rural farmland to bustling urban neighbourhood. The building itself dated to the 1860s, constructed during the great expansion that followed the railway's arrival. 3 stories of respectable brick and mortar, with decent rooms for working folk and travellers seeking temporary lodging in the capital. Nothing in its exterior suggested the horrors that lay buried beneath its foundation. The inspector rose slowly, his knees protesting against the damp cold of the cellar. He studied Mrs. Harrow's face in the lantern light, searching for some sign of guilt or complicity in her pale features. She was perhaps 50 years of age, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in the severe style favoured by women of her station. Her dress was plain but well maintained, the black wool speaking of respectability and mourning for a husband lost to consumption some 7 years prior, according to her earlier statements. Morrison had encountered many landlords and landladies in his years of service, and he knew the type well. The responsibility of maintaining a boarding house attracted a particular sort of person, one comfortable with the constant turnover of humanity, the steady parade of strangers seeking shelter beneath their roof. Most were honest folk, earning an honest living from the endless stream of workers, travellers, and unfortunates that flowed through London streets like the Thames itself. But some, he had learned, possessed darker inclinations. The power that came with controlling another person's shelter could corrupt certain souls, leading them down paths that civilized society dared not contemplate. The isolation of individual rooms, the transient nature of the tenants, the ease with which a person might simply disappear without their absence causing immediate alarm. All these factors could prove fatally tempting to one so inclined. The cellar continued to yield its grisly harvest as the night wore on. 5 distinct sets of remains emerged from the packed earth, each telling its own story of violence and concealment. The victims appeared to range in age from young adults to middle age, both men and women among the dead. Their belongings, what remained of them, suggested people of modest means, working folk who would have chosen Mrs. Harrow's establishment for its reasonable rates and convenient location near the expanding railway networks. Constable Williams, the eldest of Morrison's men, had taken charge of cataloguing the evidence with the methodical precision that came from decades of police work. Each fragment was carefully lifted, examined and recorded in his neat script. The man had served under Morrison for 15 years, and the inspector trusted his judgment implicitly. If Williams believed they were looking at deliberate murder rather than some tragic accident or natural catastrophe, then murder it most certainly was. The question that remained was the identity of the killer. Mrs. Harrow continued to maintain her innocence, though her protestations had grown weaker as the evidence accumulated around her feet. She claimed knowledge of nothing beyond the occasional complaint about strange odours, which she had attributed to the building's ageing drainage system. The sounds reported by tenants, footsteps in the night, muffled voices, the scraping of metal against stone, these she dismissed as the normal noises of an occupied building, magnified by nervous minds and thin walls. Morrison found himself studying the woman with increasing suspicion. The physical demands of digging graves and disposing of bodies would have challenged a person of her years and slight build. Yet he had learned not to underestimate human capability when driven by desperation or madness. History was filled with examples of individuals who had accomplished seemingly impossible acts when necessity demanded it. As dawn approached, painting the cellar windows with the first pale light of morning, the full extent of the horror became clear. The remains of 5 individuals lay exposed, their bones speaking silent testimony to crimes that had gone undetected for years. The boarding house had continued its normal operations above this hidden cemetery, welcoming new tenants while the old ones mouldered in the earth below. The inspector ordered his men to extend their search to other areas of the cellar, though the packed earth elsewhere showed no obvious signs of disturbance. The killer, whoever they might be, had chosen this particular corner for their grim work, perhaps drawn by the loose soil or the concealment offered by stored furniture and coal bins. The location spoke of someone familiar with the building's layout, someone with unrestricted access to the lower levels. Mrs. Harrow was taken into custody as the sun climbed higher over London's chimney-crowned skyline. She offered no resistance, walking between Morrison's constables with the resigned dignity of one who had finally reached the end of a long and troubled road. Her silence spoke more eloquently than any confession, the weight of years pressing down upon her shoulders like accumulated snow. The boarding house was sealed pending further investigation, its remaining tenants relocated to other accommodations with the assistance of the local authorities. Word of the discovery spread through the neighbourhood with the swift efficiency of gossip, transforming the respectable establishment into a source of fascination and horror for the surrounding community. In the days that followed, Morrison's investigation revealed the pattern of Mrs. Harrow's crimes. The victims were invariably solitary individuals, people without strong family connections or regular employment that might prompt immediate inquiries into their whereabouts. Travellers passing through London, workers between positions, unfortunates seeking temporary shelter while pursuing better circumstances, all had found themselves drawn to the modest boarding house on Ladbroke Grove, unaware that their landlady harboured murderous intentions. The method appeared consistent across all cases: poison, most likely administered in food or drink, followed by hasty burial in the cellar once the victim had succumbed. The motive remained unclear, though Morrison suspected simple greed played a significant role. The personal effects of the deceased, their few possessions and any money they might have carried, would have provided a steady if modest supplement to the boarding house's legitimate income. Mrs. Edith Harrow stood trial in the early months of 1890, her case attracting considerable attention from both the press and the public. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated evil, a woman who had systematically murdered her tenants for financial gain over a period of several years. The defence argued for diminished capacity, suggesting that the death of her husband and the pressures of maintaining the boarding house alone had driven their client to temporary madness. The jury required less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Mrs. Harrow was found guilty on 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She received the news with the same stoic silence that had characterized her behavior since the discovery of the bodies, offering no final confession or expression of remorse for her crimes. The execution took place on a grey morning in March, conducted within the walls of Newgate Prison according to the customs of the time. A small crowd gathered outside the prison gates, drawn by the morbid fascination that such events invariably attracted, though the actual proceedings remained hidden from public view. Mrs. Harrow met her end with apparent composure, taking whatever secrets might have remained with her into the darkness beyond. The boarding house on Ladbroke Grove stood empty for many months following the trial, its reputation tainted by association with the crimes that had taken place within its walls. Eventually, new ownership was secured and the building was thoroughly renovated, its cellar filled with fresh earth, and the floor above reinforced with additional timbers. The new proprietors made no mention of the property's history in their advertisements, hoping that time and silence might allow the building to escape its dark legacy. Inspector Morrison retired from the Metropolitan Police 2 years later, his health affected by the accumulated stress of 3 decades spent confronting London's criminal underworld. He often reflected on the case of Mrs. Harrow in his quiet moments, wondering how many other secrets lay buried beneath the city's sprawling expanse. The boarding house murders had revealed the potential for evil to flourish in even the most ordinary circumstances, a lesson that would remain with him until his final days. The victims were eventually laid to rest in a common grave in Kensal Green Cemetery, their identities established through painstaking investigation of missing persons reports and personal effects. Small headstones mark their final resting place, bearing only names and the simple inscription, "Gone but not forgotten." The autumn leaves fell gently across their graves that first November, nature's quiet benediction for lives cut tragically short. In the years that followed, the Notting Hill boarding house murders became part of London's extensive catalogue of criminal history, remembered by students of such matters, but gradually fading from public consciousness. The neighbourhood continued to grow and change, new buildings rising to house the city's expanding population, the past slowly buried beneath layers of progress and time. The case files remained in the archives of Scotland Yard, yellowing pages in manila folders that testified to the patient work of Morrison and his constables. Future investigators would sometimes consult these records, seeking insight into the methods and motivations of criminals past, though the essential mystery of human evil remained as impenetrable as ever. The fog rolled in from the Thames that final evening, wrapping London in its familiar embrace as the city settled into sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, church bells tolled the midnight hour, their bronze voices carrying across rooftops and chimney pots to mark another day's passage. The boarding house stood silent in its row, indistinguishable from its neighbours, its windows reflecting nothing but shadows and starlight. The candle burned low in Inspector Morrison's study. The chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.